Okay, so I guess we're going to start now. So I just want to thank everyone for coming. I'm Zeke, the Vice President and Acting President of the Victoria College Chapter of Phi Theta Kappa. And we are presenting the Culture of Competition of Biological Perspective. Now, before we get started, I just want to ask a simple question. What comes to mind when I say the word competition? No doubt a lot of people think of football or baseball. I'm pretty sure some of you think of, well, this, which would be accurate. These are all forms of competition. Competition is defined, after all, as a test of skill or ability, or a contest for some prize, honor, or advantage. But what happens when you shift it from just competition to biological competition? Things change then, because it's no longer about an advantage, it's a struggle between two individuals of the same or different species, for space, for life, for food, but things that they need to survive, because it's no longer a simple game. It's not fun, it's all about survival. Every competition has winners and losers, so in this case, who's the winners and who are the losers? The losers are branded with titles like endangered and threatened, and in the worst case, even extinct. And the winners, most of the time they're invasive. Not supposed to be here, but they are, and they win. Competition amongst the biological perspective, it's not fun and game. It's a matter of survival. Not for just one, but for all. Because if one of them has to compete, they all do. Our first speaker here is going to highlight the endangered and invasive species. Brent Ortego from Texas Parks and Wildlife received his Master's in Wildlife at LSU, his BS in Bachelor's, in Science and in Forestry at LSU, and his PhD at Auburn. So, Brent, if you please come up.
Thank you, Steve. That was a very good introduction. Not about me, but about the subject today. People from Texas struggle over LSU and all that, but they'll learn. A&M's getting their indoctrination and they're doing fairly well. But anyway, we're going to be talking about endangered species and invasive species. And I just went to your basic Wikipedia to give you the definition of endangered. It's basically a group of species or organisms that are endangered of disappearing. They have some similar characteristics. Most of the time, if you're getting ready to go extinct, you probably have a very small population. Many of these populations are high risk for a variety of reasons. It could be the invasives, he's mentioned it, too much competition against them. Others are just the environment's changing, and they're not able to adapt. Quite frequently, they have a very limited distribution. Some of the endangered species we know very well today had a very broad distribution. But because of landscape changes that humans brought onto the United States, the world, them being landscape species, they weren't adapted to fragmentation. And as the ecosystems were fragmented, they could not adjust. Excuse me. Thick thumb. But some of the causes of extermination are becoming endangered. Excessive harvest. We do not have many cases of this in recent centuries, but we did have one in the dodo where sailors looking for provisions when they made landfall, when they were out at sea for years. The dodo was a very simple food item. It couldn't fly. It was restricted to an island. They landed there, and they were all harvested. The most common in recent decades is island birds, island mammals. They evolved in isolation. So when new foreign species were introduced to their environment, like snakes, like cats, like rats, they ate them all. They had no adaptation to predation. We've had cases of pesticides. Now, in some situations, the pesticides were not killing the animals directly, but the accumulation of pesticides in the food chain caused some negative effects on species like bald eagle, brown pelican, peregrine falcon. Your prairie chicken, which is local, we have the last population of prairie chickens in this part of Texas, is a species mostly declining due to habitat loss. Just physically, humans taking this habitat off the landscape, and they don't have space to live. And occasionally you have these weird environmental events. When we get into management of species, we always talk about managing multiple populations. You don't want to have all your eggs in one basket. The belief with Eskimo curlew at a time when the population was fairly low, they had some kind of weather event while they're migrating over the ocean. Like the neotropical migrants are finding out yesterday and today with this big cold front and strong winds. If you get caught far enough offshore, you may not make it to land. And then we have invasives. Well, let's talk about them. What is an invasive species? Basically, it's a foreign species to a geographic area. In this case, they're talking about an ecosystem. It could be a continent, but they didn't evolve in this particular setting. And they're species that may have some environmental or economic harm. At least this is the human definition of what we're going to go with as far as invasives. Not all foreign species are bad. The vast majority of introduced species to anywhere die out. They're not adapted to the area. But a small percentage of them have the capabilities to live in this particular environment. And those particular species are the ones that become invasive. They populate an area where there's no environmental competition. They expand at a rate beyond the carrying capacity of that particular ecosystem. And they encounter species that are not able to adapt to their presence. Down here, let me see. They say only about 15% of those introduced species which actually make it actually become invasive. But okay, let's look at what we have. Oh, I have a question. Are humans invasive?
Yeah.
Depends on your definition. Since humans created the definition, they may put themselves exempt. But humans definitely have modified the world. They're one of the species that have the capability of modifying ecosystems. Very few species have that ability. But I'm going to go through a quick list to give you an idea of the number of species that are characterized as invasive by fauna or flora. And remember, this came off the internet, so it had to be correct. So you can go through the list: small numbers of amphibians, nematodes, arachnids, spiders, mammals, crustaceans, mollusks, and as you go through, reptiles, birds, you get down to the plants. That's where the majority of invasives are. And most of us, if you're not into the land management business, you don't even think about them. You walk on them every day. But a lot of insects, there's some birds and mammals. And you have diseases. You know, you get to the microbes, and they can be invasives, and some of them can be fairly serious. You've heard in the news in recent years, avian influenza, West Nile virus, people dying from West Nile, some people dying from avian influenza. Many of you probably have not heard of chestnut blight. This occurred in the 1800s, and it totally wiped out a species. One disease swept across North America. The chestnut used to be the most abundant and dominant acorn type of a tree, a nut type tree in North America. It disappeared in a few decades. They have a few examples of chestnuts and their hybrids in very controlled environments, but the blight essentially eliminated the species. And there's chronic wasting disease in some of the ungulates. One disease very serious in the mammal world right now is white nose syndrome, and that's for bats. It essentially wipes out entire populations once it gets into a cave system. And they're progressively, this disease is progressively moving across North America. And there are a lot of bats in very serious situations because of this. And locally, with our Atwater's Prairie chicken, we're going to call this REV. I'm not going to try to pronounce it. But it's a disease that's very prevalent in captive reared chickens. And it's also prevalent at a small scale in natural environment. But it's gotten into the captive reared facilities, what we're using for Atwater's Prairie chicken, and it limits some of our abilities to restock the range. And some of our favorite mammals, rats, cats. A lot of you do not think about cats. Feral and domestic house cats have been identified to have the greatest number of prey species in the world. Well in excess of 100 species cats have been known to kill, and pigs. Here's some specific invaders. Ag pests of various kinds, fire ants. We probably all deal with fire ants. European honeybee. Is this really an invader? Think about it. It didn't evolve in North America, and now it's scattered through most of North America. It's had to eliminate several species of insects as it took over their environment. It's only needed to pollinate European vegetation, which are normally crops. Some of your peaches, your pears, your cottons, all of these came from Europe. They need the honeybee, but native plants do not. And here's a species that essentially, populated most of North America, and it's had some good and bad effects. And some of the plants we deal with on a regular basis: Chinese tallow, McCartney rose, and the old world grasses. Bermuda grass you may have in your lawns. KR bluestem you see growing along our highways. These are old world grasses. That's what we got. One of the main characteristics of species that are endangered or been extinct is the inability to adapt. The world changed, and they were not able to change with it. Now, the passenger pigeons suffered from a lot of harvest. It's not regulated, it wasn't regulated harvest as what we see today, but it was harvest of people living off the land, trying to survive themselves. They saw an abundant food they thought never could end. There were billions of pigeons. Well, it ended. But as it got smaller, we got into what you see, these big landscape type species. They evolved to where they had uniform connectivity across the world. There were so many of them. They didn't need any specialized breeding conditions. They didn't need to be able to adapt to being isolated. So when the population cratered and they got these little isolated pockets, they didn't know how to deal with it. Okay, let's talk about specific whooping cranes and what invasives may be affecting them. We know whoopers, we're close to where they winter. There are several introduced populations. There's one in Florida. There's a group in Wisconsin that trained the whoopers to follow an airplane to winter down on the Gulf Coast. They restocking whoopers, hopefully to reestablish a resident population in Louisiana. And we have the native population flying from northern Canada to Texas every year. This species is being impacted by the quality of the bays. We have some actions going on in the bays that may have some serious impacts. Red tide, for instance, that is an invasive, and it occurs in algal form, and it's had some fairly serious impacts on some localized species. We haven't seen it impact whoopers yet, but it's impacted several other species, including pipe and plover, which is an endangered species. But we see the habitat changing. We get global warming. Mangroves are invading the salt marsh. Whoopers don't like tall bushes. They hide predators. So that can have an impact. In the coastal prairie, where the whoopers were normally living in prior to man, have been greatly modified. Let's look at Atwater's prairie chicken. It is the most endangered species in the United States. The entire population is based on a captive rearing program. We have maybe somewhere less than 100 birds in the wild at the beginning of breeding season. They are reproducing, but they run into problems. They have a lot of great expanses of habitat, and chickens in particular, not just this species, but other prairie grouse. They were these landscape species, and they do not do very well in isolation. So as the populations have been declining with the habitat, they became isolated with each other. And you see genetically, they got a little inbred, and reproductive vigor declines, and the population disappears. Or if the population is small enough, you get one bad weather event, whether it's a drought or a hurricane, you can lose an entire population because it's small and it's isolated. But we figured also they run into problems with imported fire ants. What we found out from studies is that the chicks that are hatching don't live beyond 14 days. A chick can live for 14 days on the yolk from the egg sac. So for some reason the chicks were not getting enough food. So we've been doing all our cooperators, been doing research, and it's shown that fire ants have reduced the biomass of insects in the prairie in the neighborhood of somewhere between 25 and 50%. And this may be a deal maker as far as these small chicks. They did a little bit of investigations, and the chicks were more likely to survive in areas with higher insect populations than areas with lower insect populations. So right now we are focusing on fire ants. It costs roughly $10 per acre per year to control fire ants. And if you look at prairie chickens in a population that requires 80,000 acres, it's not an inexpensive matter. They also have issues with invading brush in the prairie, whether it's native brush or introduced, like McCartney Rose. You also have Chinese tallow tree, which is very serious as far as reducing the quality of the prairie. And why are bushes issues to prairie chickens? Hawks like to perch on them. Owls like to perch on them. And the chickens are a big target. So they normally evolved in an open grassland where there are no trees or very few trees. So they're not as well adapted to avian predators as some other species. So the more bushes you have in the prairie, the more predators you have, and less chickens. Another species occurs in Texas. 60% of the world population of piping plover winter in Texas. It does have problems with invasives as well. House cats, rats, and dogs. You ever watch people on the beach? They like to bring their dogs to the beach. They like to ride horses on the beach. They like to drive vehicles on the beach. These birds spend most of their life on the beach. So every time you flush these birds, they're burning energy. You're displacing them. It requires they need more food. The more they're displaced, the more they're disrupted, their survival goes down. Also, in their breeding grounds, they nest on the beach. So if you have a high rat population, you got feral cats or even domesticated cats near these beach nesting areas, they eat the babies, they'll eat the adults. And a little bit in the case of dogs. So invaders do have issues. Anybody ever see an Opplomata falcon? Paul has down here. Opplomata falcon is more of a tropical falcon with its northern range in the United States. It occurred in Texas through the 1920s, and then it disappeared. It wasn't to direct action, people going out and doing something against the Opplomata falcon. What we think happened with it was the natural fires that occurred across the prairies. Before humans were here, you had a lightning strike somewhere 50 miles away. The fire may have carried all the way to the coast in dry conditions. Well, those fires no longer occur. You have ag fields, you have roads, you have highways. The prairies started being invaded by brush. The brush harbors owls. Some endangered birds, you kind of wonder how they ever survive. Well, owls like eating falcons. These falcons perch up in the open, and so they're very vulnerable for being eaten by owls. And as brush invaded the prairies, falcons disappeared. So we have a private organization called the Peregrine Fund that have been restocking falcons. They're on Matagorda Island, they're on Mustang Island, they're down on South Padre, and they're doing fairly well in areas where there are no bushes. So part of our management is to remove bushes from the coastal zone so there are no owls, so we can have more falcons. The bushes are invading an area where normally they would not occur in the normal natural situation. Here's another effect of invaders that was not a direct impact. And as you go into these invaders, there's all kind of ways they can alter your environment. Well, these birds were impacted primarily because of boll weevil. Cotton was a major cash crop in the United States. Insects were reducing the production, so you controlled insects. Some of the first pesticides they developed were not tested to see their impacts on the environment. The pesticides did not directly kill these birds, but you had a bioaccumulation of pesticides within the environment as the pesticides went up the food chain. The result was they accumulated in these high-end predators. Didn't kill them, but it caused them to lose calcium production. So if they lost calcium production, your eggshells were thinner than they naturally would be. So when they sat on their eggs, the eggs broke. Populations crashed. Eagles in Texas declined to 4 pairs by the 1970s, mostly due to DDT. Brown pelicans disappeared totally as a breed. Peregrine falcons never bred here, but they migrated through. So these species were all heavily impacted. Here comes Silent Spring. Regulations were passed. DDT outlawed, and their population started increasing along with some fairly intensive conservation management. Brown pelicans are delisted. We now have more brown pelicans than have been historically recorded in Texas. Bald eagles, we're up to about 250 pairs in Texas. That's a long way from the 4 we started with. And peregrine falcons are migrating now in such numbers, they think they're affecting the way other species migrate. They're a very efficient predator, and they love feeding on shorebirds. And some shorebirds are starting to alter their migration routes, and this may be one of the culprits causing them to change. And lastly, these are the species that have gone extinct in Texas, not necessarily the world, but in Texas. Passenger pigeon, we all heard about the billions of them. Most of us didn't know much about Carolina parakeets. They were somewhat abundant, they were ag pests, and these were hunted down and killed. Eskimo curlew, you think an environmental event? Ivory-billed woodpecker, climax old-growth forest. And we eliminated the last patches due to war effort in the 1940s. The habitat changed by humans. Bachman's warbler. It was always a very secretive bird, and we think its habitat changes causes its demise, but we really never did learn much about the species. Greater prairie chicken. We needed ag lands for crops. We needed ag lands for cotton, for fiber, and all prairie obligates suffered because of that. Jaguars were only part of Texas. We were at the extreme end of the range, and things changed and they disappeared. Gray wolves occurred mostly in West Texas, and some were hunted, some were just landscape changed. Red wolf occurred in coastal Texas, and they occurred here as early as the 70s, as recently as the 70s. Numbers dropped primarily because of human habitation and also because of inbreeding. Canines interbreed fairly regularly, so they interbred with dogs, they interbred with coyotes, to the point where even if we didn't go out and catch the last few red wolves, crossbreeding with everything else, the genetics would have disappeared. And jaguarundi, the last one. We think this one disappeared, not so much people doing, well, it was habitat management. We think what happened to jaguarundi as brush encroachment occurred in the valley in various areas, bobcats invaded their habitat. Bobcats were a lot more competitive than jaguarundis and ocelots, and as a result, jaguarundis were kind of pushed out of their area. That's it. Do we do questions now, or at the end of the program, Zeke? Does anybody have any questions?
Brent, do you know how long DDT was
into heavy use during World War II. As the United States got industrialized for agriculture as well as biochemicals. That was about World War II. So it was in use through the 30s, and it was due to efforts of just a few private citizens. Many people recognized problems, but just a few private citizens were willing to go to bat against industry. Industry like Dow and DuPont and claimed that it was ridiculous. These things did not hurt. But they went to bat and forced people to recognize that there were problems. And once that was recognized, then things were changed. But it wasn't the government figuring out we had a problem here. It was citizens coming to the government, kind of opening the door, making them aware of what the situation was.
Sometimes kind of quietening around the edges and just kind of growing into it. But as I said, we were older and remember a lot of shouting.
Paul?
You know, when they reestablished the models out on Matador Island, they tried to reestablish them on the blackjack peninsula, but that completely failed because there are enough great horned owls.
Yeah, it was owl predation was the limiting factor. They tried introducing alpha models in quite a few places, and the end result was if there was any great horned owls anywhere around, they were going to kill the falcons. The falcons were not very bright. They were coming out of captivity. You know, these weren't wild falcons that survived in the wild and repopulated an area where the species used to be. These were birds raised in a pen. When they were about, I don't know, 3-4 weeks of age, they were put in a pen out in the field, on the prairie, and hand-fed by volunteers and watched. And eventually they got loose. They were dumb, they were young, they perched out in the open, easy food. But you're right, they had to find the setting. Do you have a question?
If you've been to Florida, and there's a lot of places when you're driving along the beach that you can't stop or park or anything, they're protected. And I noticed they curtailed building and everything access. Do you foresee that for Texas beaches to protect some of the birds?
It's potential, but I don't see it as in the near future that it's going to be anything like that. The Texas Open Beaches law has been there for a long time, and you know, laws is kind of a human evolution. They're created to solve a problem, and over time, they get built into your mental consciousness. So a large segment of the Texas population grew up with open beaches. Now there's some rules applied to beaches, and there are some areas that are closed. There are some areas where vehicles are closed. But by law, it's going to take some major event to modify the open beach law in Texas. Florida has other issues. They like to fuss at us about our open beaches. We fuss at them about some other things they have over there. But any of the rules you see across the landscape, whether it's Texas, Florida, Maine, it's an evolutionary process with people, and it's all people driven, how to solve problems. And it has to be something compatible with society. But every state has their own little evolution of how to try to solve problems.
But there are places that are set aside.
Well, there are certain places like some of your state parks, they have it blocked off, no vehicles. The Padre Island National Seashore, they have about a mile or two, no vehicles. But they own 60 miles of beach. Fortunately in Texas, as far as beaches go, we're better than most states, and we have but we have a couple of area islands that essentially have no vehicles on them. So you have San Jose Island, which is private. You have Matador Island, which is public. But we have no road access. So there you have 60 miles of open beaches with no vehicle access. The Padre Island National Seashore, the bulk of it is so hard to get to that there's not a huge amount of disturbances, except for a few minor periods during the year. Mustang Island, on the other hand, there are people there all the time. Galveston Island, people there all the time. Up the coast, there's Matagorda Peninsula, which has very little bit of human impact. So 50–60% of the Texas coast has very few vehicles, but 30–40% does have quite a few. But it'll have to be people-driven to change the laws, and it'll have to be something society is willing to accept.
With regard to that, I mean, you know, obviously, much of this translates into politics, and how do you combat the attitude that if they can't adapt, they're supposed to be?
We all elect officials.
Okay.
And most officials I see, they listen. You know, they may listen to certain constituents more than others, but most of them are willing to listen, and they get elected. If they want to be re-elected, they have to be voted in. So at some point, at some scale, you do control what's happening, even though you're one of, how many million we have in Texas? 20-something million. But anyway, there is a system in place where things can be changed. But I'm not here to tell you how to do that. But what I am saying, it's a society-driven world we live in, and you have to work within those concepts, the evolution of laws, evolution of how we look at things, how we look at the environment. What are we willing to change? What part of your lifestyle are you willing to change? Are you willing to get rid of your St. Augustine lawn? Are you really willing to get rid of Bermuda grass? How about those nice ornamental roses you have growing? If you say, let's go all native, those are all exotic. So we have to look at our own lifestyles and what needs changed, and they'll have some effect on the world. Watering the lawns can have a big effect. The roses, as long as you keep them isolated, they don't do like the McCarthy rose, they're probably okay. Any other questions? What? Oh, excuse me.
I was wondering if you had any information to share regarding salt cedar.
As to what?
As to the amount of water the trees consume. I read somewhere that one tree can consume about as much water as a human being a year.
Salt cedars consume a lot of water. The simple solution was to go kill all the salt cedar. And in doing that, it caused other problems. They are working on the problem, and salt cedar is a major invader of western riparian zones. It produces chemicals under its leaves that inhibits plant growth, so it inhibits competition. And if you look at the amount of leaf surface, you get an idea of how much water a plant will uptake based on how much leaf surface it has. More leaf surface, more water required. So salt cedar is a very bushy tree with a lot of fine needle-like leaves, so it has a large leaf surface. It takes in a lot of water. The places that were totally wiped out of salt cedar are not doing quite so good. So there needs to be some more of an integrated approach as to how to kill the salt cedar and get vegetation reestablished and have the water system there operate a little better. But it is a very serious invader. But it's not, we have to learn exactly how to best control it to get back to where we want to go. I'm going to hang around to the end of the presentation. I enjoy talking to you. I'll be here to talk to you a little bit more. Thank you.